At Pathfinders, we have created something that we call a vulnerability indicator, and it's 12 points. We found that if survivors have 6 or more of these 12 points, not survivors, if women who are potentially vulnerable to becoming trafficked have 6 or more of these indicators, which hopefully we should see very, very quickly, that they're likely to be trafficked within the next 6 to 12 months. And so we'll see that on our 12-point indicator, one of the things that we found is a prior history of sexual abuse. There's also poverty, single parents, coming from a single parent home, mainly with the mother and the father absent. And so I think one of the takeaways for me, like I said, is the fact that this cycle of trauma and abuse doesn't begin in the way that we think of it. Okay, the person was trafficked, let's start from there. We need to go back and look at the history, and you will find that all of those things contribute to the vulnerability of becoming trafficked. Another thing that I wrote down is that we need to change the framing of our questions. So instead of accusing people, using that word, why didn't you leave? What were you doing there? Whatever. It's important that we say, it's important that we say, instead of saying, why did you stay? The guy was abusing you, you're being trafficked, why didn't you just run? It's important that we change the question to, why couldn't you leave? Because when you frame it that way, as opposed to, why did you stay? It's judgmental, it's accusatory when you say, why did you stay? But if you frame it as, why couldn't you leave? Then the person will usually give you, like she said, a list of reasons why. Financial dependency, emotional dependency, Stockholm syndrome, I had children, where am I going to get my money? They'll give you all the reasons, and then you start to address those things, as opposed to just judging them for staying in a situation of abuse. And so we'll send you all the slides, and please, if you do receive them and they're useful to you, definitely let us know. All right, so we'll move on to our next session now.
We agreed 2 p.m. apt now. Where are you?
I said I'm coming.
Mommy, I'm hearing ring road in the background. And which one is you are coming now? But I was supposed to meet at Protea Hotel. It's now 3 p.m.
I'm on my way.
Oh. Okay, where exactly are you?
I'm coming.
Time is going.
You stop stressing me. I'm on my way.
See, it's 3 p.m. 1 hour late already.
Oh, I told you I'm coming.
Oh yeah, now, please. There's no time.
I'm almost there. I'm almost there. I'm coming.
Finally. So 1 hour is I'm coming. It's been a long time. I would have been seeing your pictures on Facebook. How have you been?
My sister.
Wait though. Is that your baby?
Eh?
Is that your baby?
Well, this one on my back. It's my baby now.
Wow. You don't know. I'm your best friend. I didn't even know you were pregnant. All the pictures on WhatsApp, you were looking. Oh, okay.
Oh. Yeah, so it's my baby.
Okay.
I just had her last week.
Okay, bestie, congratulations. So, well, how are you?
I'm fine.
You're fine. Talk to me. How are you?
I said I'm fine.
You gave birth. I didn't know you were pregnant. 9 months.
I'm fine.
Yeah? Okay. No problem. There's no problem. All right. So we just did that little skit for you all to start. That's very, very common in conversation in Nigeria. If you say I'm coming could mean you haven't even left Lagos. And you're on your way to Benin now. Come and say I'm coming. So it's now up to me as the listener to now be trying to figure out by using objective cues. Is that chicken in the background? Or that means you're still at your home because you grow chicken. Ring road. You're hearing somebody saying, what people say in Lagos for Molwe? Used to be Molwe. Somebody give me Oshodi. So, but you mean you're still 2 hours away, I'm coming. And then the other thing that annoys me the most in Nigeria, how are you? I'm fine. Today might be your wedding day, I'm fine. Today you might be in the hospital on your deathbed, I'm fine. I'm fine covers everything from the best day of your life to the worst day of your life. I'm fine. It is well. Thank you. That's another one. It is well. It's well. No, it's not well though. Even inside. Yeah. Yeah, but we tend to say things. We're very vague as Nigerians. How can I have my baby last week and my best friend had no idea? They'll tell you, say, don't go put some sand on my Gary. May your village people not go poison my bikini. So those are the kind of things that we want to talk about today on effective communication. All right, so we have our next slide, please. We mentioned the Insight project yesterday. That's powered through the European Union, through ICMPD. So our training session today, effective communication skills for service providers. Our objective today is to develop a communications framework which provides effective skills for understanding and assisting victims of trafficking. So what exactly is communication? Communication is the manner in which one imparts or interchanges thoughts, opinions, or information by speech, writing, or signs. So we tend to think of communication, the first thing that comes to your mind is verbal, right? You're having a conversation with somebody. But it's so much more than that. It's also the way that and you can also communicate through writing, you communicate through signs as well. So there's a big difference between communication and effective communication. Right, so when communication is effective, that means it serves a purpose. Right, it has information within it that accomplishes a purpose and produces the intended or expected result. So if I tell you I'm fine, is that communication or effective communication? Okay. So if I tell you, actually, you know what? This marriage where I entered this week, things are really, really hard. I had my baby, my husband didn't even show up at the hospital. Now, is that regular communication or effective communication? Okay. So what are the goals of effective communication? For those of us who are working with survivors particularly, it's to identify the survivors' needs and attempt to meet them, to protect the safety of survivors, to obtain information, to provide information, to be sensitive to specific needs or concerns. Why is effective communication important? The primary reason is because it builds trust with the survivor. You're better able to help the survivor move forward and regain control over their lives. It avoids re-traumatizing and re-victimizing. So let's say somebody comes to you as a survivor and they've told you their story, but you didn't take notes. You didn't write anything down. Then the next time they come to you, you're still asking the same questions. Dr. Kerry just mentioned it. Every situation, we know that at least, at a minimum, every survivor tells their story and retells their story a minimum of 8 times. So imagine having to revisit, in addition to what you're suffering in your mind, all the stress that you're dealing with, having to tell your story over and over again because the service provider was not trained well enough to actually take notes to avoid having to re-trigger some of these things. It also increases the likelihood that the survivor will be willing to prosecute a case against the trafficker. And so what do we mean by that? How effective I am as a service provider increases the chances that the survivor might actually be interested in prosecuting the case. So a lot of times because you are the first responder, you're the first person that they interact with, if they have that bad experience with you, are they going to come back to say, okay, let me now continue with the task force, let me continue with NAPTIP, when that initial person that they met gave them a difficult time? We have survivors that we have in our shelter that they came through another organization or they've had a prior experience at a different shelter. And when they come to us, it takes months sometimes to break down all the experiences that they previously had before they even are thinking about maybe prosecuting the case against the trafficker. And that's because the initial experience with that initial shelter was not one that was good for them. All right, so what are the 5 pillars for effective communication? We have active listening, observation, nonverbal communication, Paraphrasing and Affirmations, Open and Closed-Ended Questions, Awareness of Cultural Styles of Communication. We'll start with active listening. Active listening is listening with a purpose. Inactive listening is simply hearing. So how many of us know there's a difference between hearing and listening? Because you can hear the sound of my voice now, but you can still be on your phone, right? Many of you texting somebody, and you will not actually be able to tell me back what I just said. Everybody will not laugh. You will not say, why are they laughing? What is she? But you're hearing the sound of my voice, right? So there's a big distinction. And so when you're actively listening, you're actually paying attention to what is actually being said. You're listening with a purpose, right? People can speak 100 to 175 words per minute. But you can actually listen intelligently to 600 to 800 words per minute. And so the ways to actively listen, particularly to survivors that are overcoming trauma, is to be attentive, right? Don't fidget. Don't daydream. Stop getting on your phone while they're telling you their story. I mean, if you actually want the person to start to build a level of trust with you, but someone is telling me their story, crying and everything, I'm saying, please, did you order the jollof? Yes, no, I'm listening, go ahead, go continue. Eh? Did you see that Facebook? Hey! Wow! Look at that. No, I'm with you. No, continue, please. I mean, how many people turned off immediately by that? You know the person doesn't really care about your situation, right? Exert the patience that it will take to hear the full story. Stop interrupting me. We love doing that as Nigerians. Okay, Dr. Kemi, please start telling me a story.
Okay, so as I was going through that past that night, I had this intuition not to go. But because of the fact that
Go to which person?
I said going from my house to the church, that I needed to go for the video.
Okay.
And so, that thing was just
Please, sorry, your name again?
I am Kemi Akitoyeshe.
Okay. Have we met? We've met.
Yes.
Okay, so which part then? Sorry,
Okay, so that part, the part from my house.
I'm coming, just 1 second. Let me get it off. So you see what I'm talking about? That interruption, it causes frustration on the part of the person that you're trying to serve. But it also shows to the person, it conveys to the person that you're listening to that you're not present. You're not physically there, actually hearing actively and listening. The next thing is to ask for clarification if necessary and repeat the information back to the survivor. So one of the ways to do that is after the person tells you something to say, well, what I hear you saying is, or are you sure is this what you meant, right? So getting clarification, that's part of active listening. Taking notes, I mentioned that earlier. Stop talking and don't assume you know what the survivor is going to say. This one is so annoying to me. Grace, please start talking.
So I was hungry yesterday.
You're hungry?
Yeah, so I went.
And I know jollof is your favorite. Sorry.
Okay, I was going to Greenwood.
Mm-hmm.
If I could get to a restaurant and get.
Did you see the new restaurant?
Which
And the one at Kada Plaza,
No, Greenwood.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, Greenwood. So I was able to see one, getting inside, but they didn't have.
The meat pie.
No, I wasn't going for meat pie.
The samosa.
Wait now, I was not.
I'm waiting now. You're not telling me to wait. I'm listening, yeah? Mm-hmm.
Okay. I just wanted to collect.
The
Salad.
what?
Salad.
Okay. I know coleslaw is your favorite.
Chicken salad.
Yeah. Okay. It's actually chicken. All right. So please stop assuming. Let the person talk. This might be the first time they've had an opportunity to actually be listened to. So we have a lot of survivors, I'm sure you guys do too. When they start talking, the story seems to just jump around from here. Oh, they went back to Libya, but you're like, you were just telling me about after we got back. They now jump to Libya. From there, they talk about when they went to Kano, and so for those of us who may not have had that sort of trauma, right, it doesn't make logical sense. So we start questioning them. That part must not be true. That part must not be true. You're lying about this. You're lying about that. But you have to remember, as Dr. Kemi was saying, Trauma affects your memory. It affects your judgment. And so we have to be a little bit more patient. And then please don't argue. Don't argue with the survivor. Please, Pastor Hope, start telling me something.
Yeah, so I was feeling so sleepy 3 days
You
ago.
were feeling sleepy.
Yeah,
Why?
yeah, because I needed to do some.
Eh? Speak up, okay? I don't hear you.
Yeah, I made a trip 3 days ago, and
3 days. 3 whole days. Yes. All right. Next thing is paraphrasing and affirmations. So paraphrasing is not repeating to the survivor in their own words what they said, right? So it's actually repeating in your own words what the person said. Okay, so Nkechi, please tell me one sentence. Or tell me a story. How did you get here today?
Okay, so I was going to see this woman. She promised me she would send me to someone in Lagos to help me get a job.
Okay.
And then on my way, we had this, the bus broke down on our way. And I had to go and other people to Lagos. I got there a bit late, and she started shouting that I've missed the interview because that was the last chance.
Okay. So what I hear you saying is that you were on your way to Lagos, you got to Lagos, and you weren't able to actually make the interview. Is that correct? So we see the distinction, right? Not just using her exact words and then saying I'm paraphrasing. You use your own words because that's how you process. You understand? It's different from the way that she said it. Because when you use your own words, you'll actually remember better. And then the next thing is it's about paraphrasing and affirmations is a way to test your comprehension and to avoid misunderstandings. So one of the things that my staff loves that I do, you guys love it, right? Yes. whenever I give any instruction, sometimes I'll ask them to repeat back to me what I said. And it's not a way of me trying to control them. It's just to make sure that we're both on the same page, right? So, earlier this morning I texted Pastor Hope and I said, look, please, let's make sure that we get late checkout for the people who were staying at the hotel, right? So when I came in and I saw him in person, I asked him the same question, did we get late check? He didn't respond to my text because he was busy doing something else. And so when I came in, the onus was on me to check up with him because he didn't respond to my text. Did we get late checkout? And he said, yes, he had already arranged that. And so that's a way to avoid a misunderstanding, right? So the fact that he didn't text me back, because I trust him, I know that if he couldn't text me back, it's actually because he was probably doing something in preparation for today. And so rather than just assuming, this guy didn't even bother texting me back, just ask, did you get my text? Okay? And then the next example, I'm going to give you some examples now of paraphrasing with such words as, so what I hear you saying, in other words, sorry, I'll go back please. What I understand you to be saying is, if I hear you correctly, those are different ways that we can introduce paraphrasing. Next are affirmations. Affirmations are statements that recognize and validate a survivor's experience and strength. These are some examples here. An affirmation, you're actually validating in some ways the experience of the survivor. So you can say things like, wow, that must have been really difficult for you. That's actually a really good question that you just asked. You took a big step. You certainly have to cope with a lot of problems right now. And that's just a way of the person, of stepping into the person's shoes and showing a bit more empathy by affirming them. The third is observations and nonverbal communication. Dr. Kate discussed this a little bit earlier. But to observe means that you're being aware of the entire situation and the circumstances. Right? So much of the information that a service provider, that we receive as service providers, will be through non-verbal communication. So the truth is that only about 7% of communication is verbal. So if you think of communication as 100%, only about 7% of it is verbal. Of the remaining 93%, 38% is vocal. And we're very vocal in Nigeria. We love vocal. Yeah, oh, ha, hey. That's very different from verbal, right? Verbal is actually using words. But vocal is something that's culturally very prevalent for us. 38% of that is vocal and 55% is facial. Now that we're all wearing masks, it's harder to see facial expressions, but you can see it in the eyes a lot of times as well. Some aspects of nonverbal communication include physical space. So the people that are very close talkers, please come, please. They can't talk to you until they are here like this. You guys know what I'm talking about. So you're not trying to be stepping back small. You're trying to use that to step back. Step on now. So I was just saying, I had a touch of just a difficult day. And, so we need to respect the people's personal space. To me, I usually like to give people at least 1 arm's length, and my arms are very long. And now with COVID, 6 to 12, 6 to 12 meters. Yeah, so please. But it's important that we respect that physical space. If someone is making very clear that they're uncomfortable, please don't force yourself into their physical space. Personal touch. A general rule of survivor assistance is never to touch a survivor unless the survivor specifically invites such a gesture. Right, so yesterday we had 3 of our survivors that were here. And I'm a very touchy, huggy kind of person. But when they initially come to us, I let them take the lead, right? So if I can see that, they're just meeting me for the first time, and my initial instinct is to just go, oh my God, just to hug them and everything. But if I can tell that they're a little bit shy and they're being a bit reticent, then my response is to step back, and just say, hello, nice to meet you. You can still smile. You can still communicate that level of comfort in your smile. Eye contact. Eye contact in Nigeria. The parents that you're looking at in the eye, that's a sign of disrespect. You must put your head down. You must lay low. You must bow down. You see what I'm saying? But there are other cultures, particularly in the West, where if you don't make eye contact, it's a sign of maybe you're hiding something, or you actually don't trust me, or you're not being truthful, right? So I think it's important that we take into context, again, where we are. Facial expressions, they should reveal empathy and understanding. Gestures, we love gestures. I'm a hand talker. My hands are constantly moving when I'm talking. Some gestures are universally acceptable as signs of welcome and respect. And then appearance. Survivor advocates should always try to appear professional regardless of the work environment. Next is open and closed-ended questions. The objective of asking questions is actually to gather information, right? It's inappropriate to ask questions out of curiosity. Let me give another example of someone you haven't. What's your name again? Eloho, right, Genesis House, Freedom Foundation in Lagos. All right, so just start telling me a story.
I grew up in a very poor family system where
How poor? Because I saw I grew up in a poor, this was how poor?
my mom sells fish.
Fish.
My dad does mechanics.
Is that poor? Sorry, continue.
My father does not like paying
Does not like what?
me and my sister's school fees.
Can you imagine?
He,
But he's paying your brothers, right?
yes, only
Right.
the eldest
The other son.
and the other them for mechanic training.
Really? Wow.
So they can take over it.
Where did I get that information on the training? Asking questions out of curiosity. That's not your business. It's not focus on what you are there to actually do, right? So closed-ended questions usually require a brief yes or no. A lot of times I think we're trained as service providers to always ask open-ended questions, but that may not necessarily be necessary, right? So, especially if someone calls you in a panic, right? One of the example of a closed-ended question is, are you in a safe place, right? If the abuser is right there, the trafficker is right there, they can't start telling you, oh no, I'm actually, are you in a safe place, yes or no, right? That's a question that they can answer without actually giving away any information if the abuser is actually there in the same room with them. Do you want me to call anyone for you? It's a yes or no. Or would you like something to drink? Yes or no. Open-ended questions cannot be answered with a yes or no, right? They allow you to get more information. Typically, they begin with how, when, what, where, why. An example is, tell me about the last time that you actually went to Lagos for an interview. So here again, it's important that we're aware of cultural styles of communication, right? So it's important that by acquiring an awareness of cultural communication styles, which is how people express themselves, how they display emotions, and how they deal with crisis and conflict, service providers can adapt their own communication style to that person, right? So initially when we started PGI, I used to do a lot of work with rape survivors in the Northeast because that was around the time when the girls from Chibok were abducted. And so I find, that they're a lot more shy, a lot more quiet, a lot more reticent, right? As opposed to sometimes some of the work that we do with girls here in the South that are a bit more exposed, right? And so the way that I interact with the girls from the North is very different from the way that I interact with the girls from the South. And so it's important that you take into consideration some of those cultural differences as you work with survivors. Suggestions for increasing awareness of cultural styles: attend a cross-cultural communications training, right? Just because you work in Lagos doesn't mean that all people that you work with are going to be speaking Yoruba. The way that Hausas present is very different from the way that Benin people present, right? So if there's an opportunity for you to take a course on cross-cultural training, communications training, please do that. Learn how different cultures deal with crisis and acquire support when in crisis, right? So some people, someone mentioned yesterday, we're very religious. Over 90% of people in Nigeria are religious, right? So a lot of people, go back please. A lot of people will actually go to their spiritual elders or to their clergy when they're in a moment of crisis, right? But some people just keep it to themselves. So you have to be able to differentiate, right, what people's cultural styles might be. Learn how cultures communicate non-verbally. And I think that's something that we also need to be cognizant of, because the way that my mom is half Yoruba. She speaks to me as well, I understand Yoruba, which I don't understand, but she insists on doing it anyway. And so I've learned a few things, in the way that she talks. I'm trying to remember something that she says. I can't remember it, but when she's speaking in Yoruba, she has a very different tone from the way when she speaks Benin. And she also speaks a little bit of Igbo. And so I was like, I'm like, this is the same person, right? But she has a different way. When she's speaking in Yoruba, she's very expressive. I mean, the voice, the octaves of her voice change. They go high, low. When she's speaking in Benin, in Benin get one kind of bush sound. People know what I'm talking about. But that's what I'm saying. Take into consideration, I think, all those things as well. Also learn how different cultures react in conflict. In some cultures, conflict is dealt with directly, while in others, open conflict is experienced as disrespectful. So in different households, right, a survivor of rape, for example, might have, can you go back please, might have been trying to talk to her mother about how her father is abusing her. There's some cultures where you actually cannot open up and speak directly, right, because of the way that it may be perceived as being disrespectful. So it's important that we actually take into consideration some of these things. Next slide. All right, so we also have blind spots that negatively affect our effective communication. So what is a blind spot? A blind spot is an area where a person's view is negatively affected. So they occur when we allow our emotions and our thoughts, usually unconscious, to influence or result in behaviors that are harmful to others or to ourselves. Effective communication with survivors in criminal prosecution. I'm going to skip this for a second and come back to examples of blind spots. Next slide. I think one of the biggest examples is implicit or unconscious bias. Right, so implicit bias is an unconscious association, a belief or attitude towards any social group. Due to implicit biases, people often attribute certain qualities or characteristics to all members of a particular group. So I'd like to have 9 volunteers, please. Any 9? 9 volunteers, please. Come up here. Thank you. 1, 2, 3. Be bold and courageous. Please just come up to me. You can stick this anywhere on you. Thank you. Respecting your personal space. Thank you. Can I hear your colors, please? Oh. There you go. All right. So we're talking about implicit bias now. Who's the 9th person? Thank you. Okay. All right. So I'd like for you to form a group. Form a group of 3. Please form a group of 3. Go ahead. Form a group of 3. Okay. All right. Form a different group of 3. Switch, form a different group of 3. Okay, all right, one more time. Form a different group of 3. Any 3. All right, so turn it around. Okay. All right. You're on this group, right? All right, so this is very interesting because this is the first time I've actually done this exercise. People don't just go to their colors and match their colors. Because whenever we do this, I always find that the 3 oranges automatically go together because they think that that's the group they're supposed to be in. The 3 purples will go together and the 3 blues. Oh no, I missed one. Okay, you're supposed to be blue, sorry. Yeah, so normally what we see is that people generally will group themselves based on the color that they had on their shirt. So you must be a different breed. Yes. It's clap for yourselves. Thank you very much. But the point of all of that is that we tend to have certain level of implicit biases, right? What we find is that instead of formulating different groups just based on proximity, right? They would just happen to be closest to each other, so the 3 of them formed like this. People tend to actually repeat behaviors or patterns that they're familiar with, right? So how many of you are sitting in the same table you sat at yesterday? Mm-hmm. Almost of them. So why did you do that? Either the AC, you knew the AC was not going to reach you there, or everybody in your table was wearing masks, or you just like that seat. For whatever reason, we're creatures of habit, right? We tend to do the same things over and over again. And that's the same thing with implicit bias, right? That means that there's something about somebody that we associate with that person. So you'll hear people say things like, The thing is, certain things that actually are stereotypical, which is the next thing that we'll discuss. But when you allow implicit bias to take over your relationship or interaction with a survivor, what you'll see is that sometimes we blame the survivor in some way, or ask questions that can be perceived as blaming. So, for example, did you provide your consent to being trafficked? First of all, it's not necessarily even relevant under the law, but because in our minds we've already decided that people who give their consent don't deserve the same kind of treatment, then that implicit bias then affects the way that we treat them. Another way that implicit bias can be seen is by stigmatizing trafficking and shaming victims of trafficking. Sometimes we treat survivors differently following specific disclosures, right? So if a survivor tells you that, she was raped in the home of her boyfriend, and she happened to, have spent the night before, or she was raped in the morning, some of us are very judgmental, right? And so we automatically think, what were you doing there? Why did you spend the night? We think that rape survivors, for some reason, must bear some level of responsibility for their rape. And so that's an implicit bias, that when the survivor then comes to you and is saying, look, this happened to me, because you already feel that way about rape survivors, it's going to negatively affect the way that you're actually interacting with this particular survivor. All right, withholding basic services from survivors such as medical care or counseling because you don't believe they should be entitled to it, or rushing through appointments or the provision of services. Next slide, please. Stereotypes and prejudice, right? A stereotype is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or a thing. So, a stereotype, an example of a stereotype we just talked about recently was with the NSARS, where a young person with dreadlocks must be a Yahoo boy, right? Or Igbos love money more than the rest of us, right? Those are stereotypes that we've heard over and over again. All Benin girls travel to Italy for prostitution. But prejudice is different from a stereotype. Prejudice is to prejudge, to maintain a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. Prejudices often rely on stereotypes and can lead to discrimination. So an example of a prejudice is an independent or wealthy single woman in Nigeria must have a sugar daddy, or there must be somebody sponsoring her. You guys, how many of you think that for real? I know you won't raise your hand. Okay, you actually raised your hand. But I think that's a prejudice that we have, right? Another a victim who was assaulted in her assailant's home, I mentioned that earlier, must bear some of the blame for her rape. So based on these examples, can anyone share any example of service provider that's either a stereotype or a prejudice? Anyone have an example? No? Okay. All right, moving on. Next slide. So stereotypes and prejudice, they actually affect the way we serve or provide service to our survivors because they tend to dehumanize the survivor. They also affect the extent to which you're willing to provide services. They prevent us from seeing and treating each survivor as an individual. And then, as Chimamanda Adichie says, she refers to what we call a single story. So when you have a particular idea in your mind, all Igbos love money, then you run into an evil person, it's easy to transfer that stereotype onto that person because of our prior prejudices and stereotypes. Any examples of a prejudice or stereotype on the way that will actually affect the way that we do our work? Why are people so quiet today now?
Some of us say there's no need for us to allow these migrants to come into our office, that we have to partition a part of our office so that they will not have access to other offices that they are not trustworthy, that during the day they may come and start requesting for their money, then at night they may come back to the office. So we had serious arguments and debates on it. Some also said we should go and rent a separate office
for the Idahosa project because of the negative things around the migrants. But at long last, we allowed them to come into our office. Then with time, they really showed, some of them showed who they really are. They kept coming to say, I need my money, I'll come and run out the office, this and that and that. So we have to employ security guards, put CCTV everywhere, and that's a prejudice, but at least part of it is true. Thank you. So we tend not to always conduct an accurate assessment of ourselves, right? We see ourselves how we see ourselves. And I had a recent example of this. A few months ago, we had a birthday party for my mom, right? A Zoom birthday party. How many of you have had Zoom birthday parties during this COVID lockdown? Zoom everything. Yeah, and so I had created a poll with 10 questions, right? Anybody who knows my mother well should be able to answer at least get the passing mark on it. And so I spent time, looking, really taking the time to create it. So my family was on the call. And so I introduced the poll. I said, please, just answer the poll on your tablets or your laptop or whatever. Don't scream out the answers. So we read the first question. And my sister said, can I just shout out the answer? And so me, as my normal, calm, loving self, heard myself saying, no, just answer the poll. Like I said earlier, didn't you hear me? Just say, and as I was saying that to her, she just shouted back, calm down, calm down. And so I was like, why would she be telling me calm? I mean, I heard myself saying, take it easy. Just answer the question. My British accent came out then. Just answer the question, yeah? And so then after we finished the Zoom party, there was towards the end of it, we were laughing and making a lot of jokes. And so the next day I said, let me just go back and watch, just to laugh again or whatever. And so I now got to the part where we're doing the poll. And so I watched somebody else shouting at my sister, no! I just told you now! This is for the poll! And so I had to step back. So that's why she said calm down. Because I was actually yelling at her that I didn't want her to destroy the poll that I had worked so hard to create. And so, but if you had asked me, I said it very calmly, just like this. Right, just calm down. There's no reason for you to actually, So sometimes we don't see ourselves the way that we actually are, right? And it takes self-assessment, to be able to go back to say, wow, I don't know who that was. So I had to call her. Sis, you say, yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry for what? Oh, I actually yelled at you yesterday on it. I told you now. I'll tell you, calm down. And I had to really, just pause and realize that sometimes we really don't see ourselves the way that we are, right? And so some examples of negative attitudes and tone, because there's a big difference, particularly with saying, hey, good afternoon, Pastor Hope, how are you? Right? Or good afternoon, how are you? Right? There's a big difference. You're saying the same words. Good afternoon, how are you? Your dress is fine. Oh, wow, I love your dress. Oh, your dress is actually beautiful. That dress looks like my size, though. That dress looks like my size. So there's a big, big difference in the way that we convey crossing your arms. I mean, for me, it's actually a very comfortable position, particularly when I'm sitting down. But for some people, they take it personally when you got your arms crossed now. It can be perceived as being very defensive, right? You're not protecting yourself or shielding yourself from something. And so when you're working with a survivor, supposing that you're aware of how your bodily, how your postures, yes, are reflected. Failing to make eye contact, we talked about earlier, distracted listening, talking on the phone, multitasking, unnecessarily raising your voice. And then their negative tones and attitudes, they immediately place a survivor on the defensive. It can lead to a survivor assuming a lack of care. Any other thoughts about how negative attitudes or tones can actually impact the way that we deal with survivors? Example?
This just brought to mind something that happened. When we first engaged our psychologist at the shelter, she had a little bit of problem penetrating the beneficiaries. So when you come, my office is right opposite hers. So when you're coming and I am down, and I say, I'm going there and see the psychologist. And then they say, I don't want to see Madam Psycho. I want to see you, Mama. Madam Psycho. So I have to first of all stop and find out why. Everybody wants to see Mama, and there's no way I can see everybody. Because there's so many things to do. So I called and said, I don't understand what the problem is. Everybody wants to see you rather than see you. Can I stay in one of the sessions so that I see how you're handling them? But madam, you guys like to do your thing by yourself. So I decided that I will partake in her sessions for 1 week. Just sit by, we'll have like a shield, so I sit by in that shield while she attends to them. So when they come in there, not knowing that I'm within the shield, look at the training shield. So, and then one thing I noticed was her tone. When I employed her, the first day, I told her, I said, you're very competent and you're very vast, but I don't like your tone. One, I don't like your countenance. I'm somebody that doesn't smile much. And I regularly squeeze my face unknowingly. So over the years, I tried to wear a smile when I remember that I'm squeezing my face. So I told her, I said, so you need to do a bit of self-examination, on yourself. And one thing I noticed is two things, which I said at the beginning, your countenance is a bit harsh. You have a soft word, but you have a countenance that counteracts that. Two, you also have a tone that doesn't endear. If you want to be a counselor or somebody who wants to motivate and somebody who wants to effect positive change, you need to have a tone that is endearing. The reason why they want to come to Mama is when you come and say, hello, love, how are you, sweetie? You look beautiful today. And then you're willing to quickly listen to me. So that tone thing is important. What her tone is loud and it's harsh, but she's very competent. So over the years, she's been with me for a year plus now. She's calmed down. I've told everybody now wants to talk to psycho. Madam Psycho, even though we have to change that, because when they call it Madam Psycho, it kind of could scare people away from you. It's like saying you go to see the doctor, So I say, she's Dr. Uche, or you call her Madam Uche, but don't call her Psycho. You understand?
That's a great example. Anyone else have an example of bad attitude, negative attitude? All right, so I wanted to address this last because it's so important. First of all, we don't have a lot of young women who are actually willing to prosecute the cases against their traffickers, particularly in Edo State. Most of the girls just want to move on with their lives. So when we do, it's important as the person who is the first responder, who they're first meeting, you're first interacting with them, to keep some of these things in mind. So effective communication in criminal prosecutions ensures that the survivors are kept abreast of the status of their cases. And we talked about that yesterday. They are afforded the opportunity to provide input on their cases. Right? It's not just somebody, telling them this is how it's going to be, this is exactly what it's going to look like. I'll give them an opportunity to actually share with you some input on their cases. Communicating with survivors in criminal prosecutions means that they're informed of their legal rights. They're assisted in completing court affidavits or victim impact statements. Make sure that they're actually receiving uninterrupted services. Right? So yesterday we had one of our survivors come and bring her baby, right? We knew that if she didn't have somebody else with her, that baby would have disrupted, her, or she would have been concerned about the baby crying because the baby was in the back. she wouldn't have been able to focus, right? And so we were able to get somebody to come with her to take care of the baby. If you're in a situation where the survivor is actually the key witness in your prosecution, it's important that you're providing uninterrupted services. So that if they have a child, for example, please pay for a creche, please pay for a nursery so that they can actually be able to come to court without having to worry about their child. If they're dealing with medical issues, they have some kind of a STD or STI, please make sure that they're actually still getting ongoing care. Because if that thing is disrupting or affecting them, they're not going to be able to get to court, right? They're not going to be able to be as focused on the criminal prosecution. Clearly understand all prosecutorial, make sure that they clearly understand all prosecutorial decisions and the reasons for them. Ensure that the victims have access to civil protection orders and safety planning. And that was something that one of our survivors mentioned yesterday, that she was afraid because once the individual was released on bail, even though he supposedly signed some sort of a document, the first thing he did was go to her father and threaten her father, right? So if there are court orders that can be applied for, that keep the survivors safe, make sure that we're actually doing that as well. Survivors are immediately notified when the perpetrator is released on bail or discharged from prison. That's effective communication. Calling up the survivor to say, oh, by the way, this person was able to make their bail, they're now out. That way the survivor can now adjust herself, take more precautions, be more careful, make sure she has a safety plan, right? If this person were to show up at her school where she's learning skills training or to show up at her house, there should be a plan in place. But she would not be able to put that plan in place unless she had the information from us as service providers. And then last, make sure that we're keeping all that information as confidential, particularly the contact information in the middle of a criminal case. All right, so how are you? We're still doing I'm fine after effective communication. Please give us the correct answer. How are you? Wait, I already said Dr. Kemi. I know you won't let me down. How are you, Dr. Kaylee?
I'm fine, thank you. And how are you too?
That's still not the answer I'm looking for now. How are you doing?
I'm good.
How are you? Okay, very well, better. Thank you very much. Are you on your way? Ricky, where are you?
Somewhere.
Somewhere. So for me, I'm looking for, I'm like the Chicken Republic. I can ask my staff. Let me just ask them. Okay. Hi, Grace.
Hi, Mom.
Okay, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Still fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm pretty cold, but I'm very okay.
Thank you. Okay, great. So where exactly are you? I've been at the frontier now for 20 minutes.
Mom, precisely at the depot beside the court, just inside. Come in, you see me at the first table, so what's the projector?
You all heard that, right? That's exactly what I've trained them well. Oh, they're afraid. So please give them a round of applause. Let's move on to the next section.